You are looking at a screen. Or perhaps it is an old yellowed page in a book resting heavily on your desk. The numbers are right there in front of you. 451 to 88. 62 conditional. It is just ink. Just black shapes on a white background. But there is a second, a very specific, very quiet second, before your brain fully translates what those numbers actually mean for your entire life. You do not move. Your breathing gets a little shallower. You do not want to take a deep breath because you feel that if you do, something fragile in the room might shatter. The silence around you suddenly feels incredibly heavy. You are sitting there, perfectly still, and a foundational pillar of the world you were raised in is quietly turning to dust. Not with a shout, not with a dramatic argument, not with lightning from the sky, just with a tally. A simple administrative vote. You are looking at the exact moment a supposedly eternal truth was legislated into existence by a terrified political institution. And the feeling in your chest right now is not anger. It is not rebellion. It is a strange, breathless vertigo. Because if this was voted on, you think to yourself, what else was? If this is how eternity is made, what exactly have I been bowing down to all these years? Because that is what you were told, is it not? Since you were old enough to understand the concept of absolute authority, you were handed a seamless, perfect narrative. You were taught that the supreme, unerring authority of the Roman pontiff was an unbroken chain, a divine mandate stretching all the way back across the centuries to Saint Peter himself. You were taught that when the Pope spoke ex cathedra, it was the literal voice of God on earth, preserved from all error, suspended high above the messiness of human history and politics. And there was a deep, profound comfort in that. When the world outside was chaotic, when your own mind was filled with doubt and the terrifying ambiguity of being human, there was a rock, an anchor, an eternal truth that did not depend on human fragility or democratic consensus. You did not have to figure everything out because someone else already had, and that someone was protected by the divine hand. You built your morality on this foundation. You built your worldview on it. You judged yourself against it, lying awake at night worrying if you were falling short of a standard set by heaven. Perhaps you even sacrificed relationships, personal desires, or your own internal compass to align with it. Because when God speaks through a man, you do not question the man. You obey. You silence the small voice inside you that says something does not make sense, because you are told that voice is pride. You are told it is a lack of faith. So you push the questions down. You fold yourself into the exact shape the institution demands. And you do it willingly because you believe you are trading your autonomy for eternal safety. But there is a terrible hidden cost to that kind of obedience. When you are convinced that a human institution is shielded from error by a divine force field, the historical record suddenly becomes a profound threat. You are trained to treat your own intellectual curiosity as a dangerous temptation. Every time you read a historical account that contradicts the pristine narrative, you are conditioned to look away, to rationalize it, or to blame your own lack of understanding. You learn to distrust your own mind. You become the warden of your own intellect, constantly policing your thoughts to ensure they do not wander outside the designated boundaries of permitted theology. It is a very specific, very exhausting type of spiritual confinement. You spend years assuming that the standard you are measuring yourself against has been flawless since the 1st century, completely unaware that the walls of your conceptual prison were hastily erected just a few generations before you were born. I remember exactly where I was when that same vertigo hit me. It was autumn in Norwich. I was still lecturing then, but spending most of my free hours buried in a private university archive, cataloging mid-19th century theological pamphlets. The air in those archives always smells of dry paper and cold dust, a smell that makes you feel entirely removed from the present day, locked in a vault with the ghosts of dead debates. I pulled out a small, unassuming tract from 1871, but it was not the printed text that stopped me. It was the margins. An Anglican scholar had filled the edges of the pages with cramped, hurried handwriting, reacting to the news coming out of Rome the year before. I read his ink, laid down over a century and a half ago. It was not an academic critique. It was quiet, profound astonishment. He was watching a human being declare himself infallible by decree, and he was watching other human beings vote to approve it. I sat there under the fluorescent lights holding that brittle, crumbling paper, and I realized that the shock I was feeling was not new. It was the exact same shock felt by the people who watched the machinery of infallibility being built in real time. We are just the generations who were handed the finished machine and told it had always been there. We are the ones who were told the paint was dry since the dawn of time, when in reality the architects were still wiping the mortar from their hands just a few generations ago. And that is the crux of the pain you are carrying now. You started to look. You did not start looking out of malice. You did not start looking because you wanted to rebel or because you wanted an excuse to live differently. You started looking because you wanted to know the truth, because you respected the truth enough to seek it out. You started reading. You started looking at history, and the seamless narrative began to show seams, large, jagged stitches holding together a fabric that you were promised was woven whole by the divine. You discovered that for most of Christian history, the idea of supreme, unilateral papal infallibility without the consent of a council was not just unrecognized, it was actively resisted. You learned about Pope Honorius I, who was formally condemned as a heretic by the Third Council of Constantinople. You read that, and you had to stop. You had to read it again, tracing the words with your finger to make sure your eyes were not deceiving you. How could an infallible pope be a heretic? How could an ecumenical council condemn him if his authority was absolute and immune to error? The question started as a whisper, a slight discomfort at the back of your mind, a cognitive dissonance that you tried to pray away, hoping God would forgive you for thinking. But the whisper grew. It became a steady drumbeat. And then you found 1870. You found the First Vatican Council, and the whisper turned into a deafening roar that you could no longer ignore, no matter how hard you pressed your hands over your ears. The more you dug into the early centuries of the faith, the more the illusion shattered. The early church operated in synods and councils. Bishops argued, debated, and corrected each other constantly. The Bishop of Rome was a point of unity, certainly an appellate judge in major disputes, but he was not an absolute, unquestionable monarch who could define dogma unilaterally without the consent of the universal church. The transition from a collegial body of equals to a spiritual dictatorship was not an overnight miracle. It was a slow, deliberate accumulation of power built over centuries on political opportunism and, occasionally, forged documents. But even with all that historical buildup, by the mid-19th century, the idea of unvarnished papal infallibility was still highly debated among faithful theologians. It was not a settled matter. It was a deeply controversial proposition that required a massive, coordinated effort to force into canon law. To understand what you found, to really grasp the magnitude of the betrayal you feel in your chest right now, You have to understand the sheer desperation of Rome in 1870. Pope Pius IX was a man watching his temporal power collapse before his very eyes. The Papal States, the actual land the Church ruled as a kingdom, were falling to the forces of Italian unification. The modern world was encroaching, bringing with it democracy, freedom of the press, and rationalism. The Pope was about to lose his literal kingdom on earth. He was cornered, terrified. So, in a brilliant and terrifying stroke of institutional survival, he decided to absolutely consolidate his kingdom of the Spirit. He convened the First Vatican Council not to discover the truth through open debate and the guidance of the Holy Spirit, but to enforce a pre-written conclusion. The dogma of papal infallibility was not a timeless truth finally being articulated for a waiting world. It was a political weapon, forged in a moment of sheer institutional panic. It was a massive, impenetrable wall built to keep the modern world out and to trap absolute authority within. And the bishops who gathered in Rome from all over the world knew it. They knew exactly what was happening. Pius IX was a complex figure, and his state of mind is crucial to understanding this tragedy. He had actually started his pontificate decades earlier as a perceived liberal, a man who might modernize the Papal States and bring the Church into a new era. But the political revolutions of 1848 had traumatized him. He had been forced to flee Rome in disguise to escape the uprisings. When he eventually returned, backed by foreign military power, he was a profoundly changed man. He had become deeply reactionary, viewing every modern development, every call for liberty or democratic representation as an existential threat to the faith itself. He had already issued the Syllabus of Errors, a document that effectively declared war on freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the very concept that the Roman pontiff should reconcile himself with progress. The First Vatican Council was the logical, terrifying conclusion of a man who felt the walls of history closing in on him. If he could not command the physical armies of Europe anymore, if he could no longer execute criminals in the Papal States or collect taxes as a king, he would instead command the absolute, unquestioning submission of the Catholic mind. We are taught, you and I, that the Church speaks with one unified voice. We are taught that ecumenical councils are harmonious gatherings where the Holy Spirit descends and guides holy men to a unanimous divine consensus. But the historical documents tell a violently different story. They tell a story of bitter, desperate, frantic resistance. You read the primary correspondence. You read the letters sent from Rome documented by men who were in the room. You read about Ignaz von Döllinger. Döllinger was not a secular skeptic trying to tear the Church down from the outside. He was one of the most prominent Catholic historians and theologians of his entire generation. He knew the Vatican archives. He knew the history of the early Church better than almost anyone alive. And he knew that what Pius IX was demanding was an unprecedented, dangerous innovation. Döllinger and others argued passionately that you cannot simply vote a new dogma into existence when the historical record blatantly contradicts it. They argued that history matters. Truth matters. For holding the exact same view on papal authority that had been standard for centuries, Döllinger was excommunicated. They cast him out into the dark. They did not answer his historical evidence. They did not debate his theology. They just silenced him, stripping him of his sacraments and his standing. This was not a spiritual awakening in the Church. It was a purge. It was the brute force of authority, crushing historical fact. And this brings you right back to those numbers on the page, the official voting records of the First Vatican Council. On the 13th of July, 1870, the preliminary vote was held on the Constitution Pastor Aeternus. This was the document that would officially declare that when the Roman pontiff speaks ex cathedra, he possesses infallibility, rendering his definitions irreformable of themselves and not from the consent of the Church. Out of the 601 bishops present in the sweltering heat of the hall, 451 voted placet. Yes, but 88 voted non-placet, no, and 62 voted placet iuxta modum. Yes, but only with major fundamental modifications. Think about those numbers for a long moment. Over 150 bishops, which is more than a quarter of the entire council, actively resisted the unreserved definition of infallibility. They knew it was historically indefensible. They knew it would tear the Church apart and alienate the eastern branches forever. You look at those numbers, and you realize with a sickening feeling in your stomach that the doctrine you were told was an eternal unanimous truth was opposed by a massive block of the very men who were tasked with defining it. It was not a consensus. It was a political battlefield, fought bitterly until the end. The pressure applied to these minority bishops was immense, suffocating, and deeply unspiritual. Historical records from the Vatican archives, brought to light by historians who dared to look, document how Pius IX personally intervened to intimidate his opponents. He altered the procedural rules of the council to heavily restrict debate, ensuring the opposition could barely speak their minds. He used the immense power of his office to coerce. He even threatened to withhold essential financial funding from desperately poor Eastern Catholic bishops if they dared to vote against him, weaponizing their poverty to secure their submission. When the minority bishops appealed to church tradition, begging him to look at the history of the previous 18 centuries, Pius famously replied that he was tradition. He said that tradition was him. Hear those words, "I am tradition." That is not the voice of a humble servant of the servants of God seeking divine guidance. That is the voice of an autocrat demanding absolute, unquestioning submission. It is the voice of a man erasing history to secure his own unassailable power. And you are supposed to build your spiritual life on the results of that coercion. Think for a moment about the reality of those men who resisted. These were not men who wanted to destroy the Church. These were men who loved it deeply, men who had devoted their entire lives to serving it. Men like Bishop Strossmayer of Croatia, who gave a blistering, courageous speech in the council hall. He argued passionately that Protestants could never be brought back into communion with a church that simply invented new dogmas by decree and ignored the ancient councils. For speaking this historical truth, he was shouted down by the majority. The Grand Hall echoed with angry calls to bring him down from the podium, silencing him with sheer volume. Imagine the stifling atmosphere in that room. It was not a place of quiet, prayerful discernment where men sought the gentle guidance of the divine. It was a partisan arena, heavy with the oppressive heat of the Roman summer and the even more oppressive weight of papal intimidation. The minority bishops were treated not as brothers in the episcopate seeking the truth, but as traitors to the crown who needed to be broken. But the most devastating moment, the detail that truly makes the floor drop out from under you, happened on the 17th of July. The night before the final definitive vote, a delegation of minority bishops, led by Archbishop Georges Darboy of Paris and Bishop Wilhelm Emanuel von Kettler, went to see the Pope one last time. Kettler, a grown man, a highly respected prince of the Church, threw himself on his knees before Pius IX. He wept. He begged the Pope to modify the text to preserve the unity of the Church and honor the truth of history. The Pope looked down at him and flatly refused. And so, facing a final vote the next morning where they would be forced to publicly say no to the Pope's face and face absolute institutional ruin. Approximately 60 bishops did the only thing they felt they could do with their consciences intact. They packed their belongings in the dead of night. They hired carriages in the dark, and they fled Rome. They physically left the city to avoid being part of the decree. Dozens of the highest-ranking men in the Catholic Church ran away in the dark rather than vote for papal infallibility. This is the foundation of the eternal truth you were taught, a midnight escape to avoid a rigged vote. The next day, the 18th of July, 1870, the final vote was held in St. Peter's. With the vast majority of the opposition having fled the city in despair, the result was a foregone conclusion, 533 to 2. The two lone dissenting voices were a bishop from Naples and a bishop from Little Rock, Arkansas, who perhaps did not get the memo to leave in time. And as the decree was officially passed, as papal infallibility was voted into existence as binding divine dogma, a massive thunderstorm broke over Rome. The sky went pitch black in the middle of the day. Lightning struck the great dome of St. Peter's Basilica. Windows shattered in the violent wind, throwing glass onto the floor of the council hall. The defenders of the Pope wrote that it was divine punctuation, like Moses receiving the law on Mount Sinai amidst thunder and lightning. The opponents, those who had fled and those who watched in horror from afar, called it divine wrath. But whatever the weather was doing, whatever the sky was saying, the human reality inside that hall was complete. The machinery had won. The political maneuver was now holy dogma, sealed and delivered to the faithful as an eternal truth. And here you are, a century and a half later, sitting in your room, carrying the heavy weight of that machinery in your own mind. You have agonized over your doubts for months, maybe years. You have felt the crushing, suffocating guilt of questioning the infallible teachings of the Church. You thought your faith was weak. You thought your intellect was proud and arrogant. You thought there was something deeply, fundamentally wrong with you for not being able to swallow the seamless narrative you were fed since childhood. You spent nights staring at the ceiling, asking God what was wrong with your heart that you could not just blindly believe like everyone else seemed to do so easily. You tortured yourself, wondering if you were losing your salvation just for noticing that the pieces did not fit together. But look at what you are actually dealing with. Look at the politics. Look at the coercion. Look at the desperate bishops fleeing in the middle of the night. Look at the excommunications of brilliant historians who simply told the truth about the past. The problem was not your faith. The problem was not your spiritual inadequacy or your pride. The variable was an institution that demanded you accept a 19th century political maneuver as a timeless divine truth. You were not losing your faith. You were responding with absolute sanity and historical honesty to a system that was built on a legislative sleight of hand. What you called a crisis of faith, what you called a spiritual failure on your part, is actually just you seeing the machinery for the very first time. You are not breaking. You are seeing clearly. You are looking at the man behind the curtain, and you are finally realizing that he is just a man. He always was. Think about the monumental unfairness of it all. You were asked to bet your soul, your eternal salvation, on a doctrine that was rammed through a council by a desperate monarch, terrified of losing his political power. You were asked to accept as divine revelation something that was achieved through suppressed debate, financial threats, and the silencing of historical fact. When you feel that friction in your spirit, when you feel that deep, intuitive sense that something is horribly wrong with the narrative, it is not the devil tempting you away from the truth. It is your own integrity trying to survive. It is your own mind refusing to be gaslit by history. You have been carrying the burden of proof for an institution that literally altered the rules of evidence to declare itself infallible. You have been holding yourself responsible for not believing a story that the architects of the story themselves had to force into existence through sheer political will. You do not need to carry that immense burden anymore. The dissonance you feel is the sound of truth, trying to break through a century and a half of carefully curated public relations. When you finally understand that this central doctrine was manufactured in a moment of panic, a profound shift happens inside you. The crippling fear that has shadowed your spiritual life begins to evaporate. You realize that your spiritual anxiety was never a sign of your unworthiness, but a completely healthy, rational reaction to a glaring historical contradiction. The cognitive dissonance was simply your intellect trying to keep you honest. You are allowed to read the history of the early church and draw the obvious logical conclusions. You are allowed to notice that the supposedly seamless garment has obvious stitches, and that some of those stitches were sewn under extreme duress in 1870. You do not have to betray your God-given reason, your capacity for logic and historical analysis, to remain a person of deep integrity. In fact, honoring the truth of history, looking reality in the eye without blinking, is perhaps the most profound act of faith you can make. It is choosing reality over a comforting illusion. Come back for a second to that screen, to that old page resting on your desk, to those numbers, 451 to 88, 62 conditional. Look at them again. Really, look at them. The silence in the room is still there. But it feels different now, does it not? It does not feel terrifying anymore. It does not feel like the heavy, suffocating silence before a punishment. It feels honest. Now, you know that the heavy feeling in your chest is not the weight of divine judgment falling upon you for your doubts. It is the weight of history. It is the realization that the men who built the modern church, the men who actually knew the history, fought tooth and nail against this decree. You are not a rebel for questioning it. You are simply taking up the mantle of the dozens of bishops who packed their bags in the dark and walked out of Rome because they could not stomach the lie. You are standing with Döllinger. You are standing with the margins of that 1871 pamphlet in the archives. You are standing with the people who saw it happen and said no. The eternal truth was voted on. It was contested. It was brutally human. And once you know that, once you really see the human hands pulling the divine levers behind the curtain, you can never unsee it. And you do not have to. You do not have to close your eyes again to prove you are faithful. The doctrine was not handed down from heaven in a state of perfect purity. It was demanded by a man, and it was conceded by a terrified council. And seeing that is not a sin. It is an act of historical courage. If you are ready to look even deeper into how these sacred narratives were constructed, if you want to see the documents and the history for yourself without the institutional filter telling you what to think, I have put something together for you. In the pinned comment below, you will find a link to the Spinoza Archive Library, a collection of 5 volumes dedicated to unpacking the historical reality behind the texts and doctrines we were told never to question. It is there for you when you are ready to keep reading before you go. If this conversation made sense to you, if it gave words to something you have been carrying quietly for a long time, the subscribe button tells the algorithm to keep sending you this kind of content. Because these are the conversations we rarely have in loud, crowded rooms. They are the conversations we usually have alone at 3 in the morning when the house is asleep. but they are exactly the conversations we need to survive the silence. Tell me in the comments, when was the exact moment you first realized that a teaching you thought was eternal was actually created by a committee? Let me know.